to read something together. I realize that the minister doesn't really like reading back and forth, but I don't think he minds if we all read together. So let's read 490, Wild Geese, together. It's a very beautiful poem by Mary Oliver, whom we lost last month and who's very close to my heart, and to those of some of you who were in the adult education class we did together just this late fall, actually. Wild Geese, 490. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and deep trees and mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. A favorite of many, I know. It's a great loss, that of Mary Oliver. Now I'm going to turn to my words for this morning. I must admit that I was kind of upset when I looked at the New York Times last week and saw Thomas Friedman's headline, "Warning, everything is going deep." I thought, what does that mean? He's really talking about things that concern him a lot, like deep surveillance, deep facial recognition, deep voice recognition, deep automation, and deep artificial minds. I thought, well, it's time to talk about something else deep before we lose that word the way we lost awesome, which we've heard many too many times. As you know, ways and paths to any kind of insight and understanding are legion. As a one-time literature professor, I would venture to say that much of what we call literature attempts to show us a way or a path. It may be a path that someone else may have taken, but one that is willing listeners or readers we temporarily make our own. There are, of course, whole bodies of literature that set out to show wayfaring itself as a way of being, more often for ill than good, I'm afraid. Think of the Odyssey, with tough, wily warrior Ulysses just trying to get home from war and encountering clanging rocks and alluring women in a classic wayfaring story. Or recall, too, the struggling Don Quixote of La Mancha, blindly fighting windmills while trying to quest like a knight. In the Bible, we have lost wayfarers in Jeremiah, the same ones who have been memorialized in our African American spirituals. And we come to know well the more purposeful wanderers, Jesus and St. Paul, and that's just naming a very few. The wayfaring I'll talk about today is something quite different from such stories. It's about what amazing things any of us can discover about him or herself and the surrounding world just by wandering openly and aware. It's a form of mindfulness, giving real significance to things one might normally take for granted. It requires not just responding and moving on, but letting something one sees or hears or engages in become a trigger for deeper thought and more associations. One of my own favorite written works in this vein is by the great haiku master Matsuo Basho. And that reminds me of welcoming, I guess, a very special guest we have this morning, and that's our former minister, Susan Manker-Seal. And I think of her when I think of Basho, because she and I used to do together a service where we poured tea over a Buddha, and I would read from Basho as she did that. Why don't you stand up and let people see this wonderful minister that we once had here. The favorite work I'm speaking of is The Narrow Road to the Deep North, a true wayfaring narrative that is deeply embedded in the way of Zen. To my mind, this exquisite short book has overtones for our UU pathways. It can remind us to take time to pay attention to the many simple things around us as we journey through our own lives. Basho really took a journey to the far north of Japan in his later life, like mine, I guess, and to the Japanese imagination of the 17th century, and that's his own time. The deep north was largely unexplored, almost legendary territory. For Basho himself, the trip would also represent an exploration of the inner self, the mysteries of the self in the universe. He traveled as a thoughtful UU might travel, seeking something deeper through the things that are, simple things, or brief encounters that by their very nature are ephemeral, destined to perish. Basho's is a journey to meaning, a journey into mystery. It is also a journey into greater simplicity. For him, spirit can permeate every area of life at every moment in his journey. Here's what he himself says of that journey. Days and months are travelers of eternity. So are the years that pass us by. Those who steer a boat across the sea or drive a horse over the earth till they succumb to the weight of years spend every minute of their lives traveling. I myself have been tempted for a long time by the cloud-moving wind, which we just sang to, actually, filled with a strong desire to wander. In this little book of travel is included everything under the sky, not only that which is hoary and dry, but also that which is young and colorful, not only that which is strong and imposing, but also that which is feeble and ephemeral. In other words, Basho's journey also is metaphoric. Travel is life, life is travel, and there's no end to such wayfaring until we die. In effect, we are born on the road and we die on the road. For the Basho-like traveler who is not simply sightseeing, it is rarely an easy road. It is through reflecting on such a journey that Basho produces the art of haibun, a prose work studied with haiku poetry, and that's the basis of his wonderful Narrow Road to the Deep North. Here the poet breaks into haiku when prose can no longer serve him. His poem momentarily interrupts the travel narrative and offers a brief insight into a more profound way of not just wayfaring, but of seeing and of living more deeply. What can we as UUs learn from Basho's kind of wayfaring? Must we, like Basho, cast away our daily lives and go in quest of something more profound? No, I don't think we do. Nevertheless, we can find a great deal in this little book if we think about our UU principles. For example, we find that our UU journey celebrates the worth and dignity of every human being, compassion, honest acceptance of one another, and respect for the interdependent web of all existence. Basho was encountering, no, I dare say, experiencing each of those ideas as he wended his way northward. Let us for a moment here today allow him to become a worthy guide for us in our own wayfaring. And let me read from the Narrow Road and gloss just 2 examples to suggest how. Here comes the first one, if I can find it. Exhausted by the labor of crossing many dangerous places by the sea, with such horrible names as children desert parents, or parents desert children, or dog denying, or horse repelling, I went to bed early when I reached the barrier gate of Ichiburi. The voices of 2 young women whispering in the next room, however, kept creeping into my ears. They were talking to an elderly man, and I gathered from their whispers that they were concubines from Niigata. Okay, I'm not going to talk about all this rest of this Japanese. I sympathize with him, he goes on, for as they said themselves among their whispers, their life was such that they had to drift along even as the white froth of waters that beat on the shore, and having been forced to find a new companion each night, they had to renew their pledge of false love at every turn. Well, he doesn't sleep very well that night, as you might imagine, but the next morning he steps onto the road and he meets them again. They approach him and they said with tears in their eyes, "We are forlorn travelers, complete strangers on this road," and they ask to go with him. And he tries to explain that he's on a different kind of journey from theirs, but he really would like to help them, but he can't. He isn't even going in the same direction. But then, he says, "As I stepped away from them, however, my heart was filled with persisting pity." And then he can't go any longer in prose, and he breaks into a haiku. "Under the same roof, we all slept together, concubines and I, bush clovers and the moon." Basho offers use an example of compassion for all things, even though he cannot carry the prostitutes alongside on his own personal spiritual journey. For him, the two women are accepted for their worth as human beings. Moreover, when he stops to celebrate their lives in poetry, he recalls not just the women, but a nearby bush clover, a small shrub with tiny blossoms, and the moon, all three of which are intertwined in his rendering of the night at the inn, and each of which carries similar weight in the poem. The people are not more important than the bush clover or the moon. They become parts of one fabric, sculpted together as equivalents in one recollected night. For me, at least, the lesson here is profound, and I better take a drink of water or I will lose it. Anywhere along our own journey, our own wayfaring through our lives, something seemingly simple, like a chance encounter or an interrupted night's sleep, can remind us of our own principles. Basho did not pound on the wall, hush the women, or sigh in disgust at their sexual goings-on. He celebrated his encounter with lines of poetry, and not only about the women, but about the moon that night and a nearby plant as well. For Basho, there is nearly always something one could call almost holy in nature, as well as in compassion for other human beings. On another occasion during his wayfaring north, he pays tribute to both meditative silence and the loudness of a summer insect, again breaking into poetry when prose seems insufficient to carry feelings far enough. And this is my last reading from him, but let me find this one for you. Okay. There was a temple in the province of Yamagata, and he's told by his friends that he has to go there. It's a very holy place. And so he says, "Since everybody advised me to see it, I changed my course. And I went there, though it meant walking an extra 7 miles to do so. When I reached it, the late afternoon sun was still lingering over the scene. After arranging to stay with the priests at the foot of the mountain, I climbed to the temple situated near the summit. The whole mountain was made of massive rocks thrown together, covered with age-old pines and oaks. The stony ground itself bore the color of eternity, paved with velvet moss. The doors of the shrines built on the rocks were firmly barred, and there was not a sound to be heard. As I moved on all fours from rock to rock, bowing reverently at every shrine, I felt the purifying power of this holy environment pervading my whole being." And now, once again, he breaks into haiku. "In the utter silence of a temple, a cicada's voice penetrates the rocks." Here again, Basho was not unnerved by or angered by a cicada's interruption of his meditative silence, a silence he tells us he has deliberately set out to find. The cicada's scream is part and parcel of the experience, what he has found through wayfaring 7 miles off of his chosen course. In the poem, the insect carries the same, no, I dare say for me, more weight than the sought-for quiet of the grounds of the shrine, so beautifully described. A few years ago, Elizabeth Reed, who is sitting here on the aisle this morning, gave a wonderful service on Taoism, to which I interjected, and I do remember this well, Elizabeth, through a famous quote from the Tao Te Ching, that in carrying water and chopping wood, one might find the beautiful Tao. Taoism, along with Mahayana Buddhism, was one of the components of Basho Zen Buddhism. Basho finds spirit through encounters with everything: people, moon, shrubs, moss, insects, rain, even rocks. For Basho, there is no separation between spirit and matter, between people and the other things of the world. To put it another way, between self and other, which we talk about all the time these days. Everything he experiences on his way, whether a thing of beauty or something he may momentarily find pitiable or strange, has value and is a source of both art and personal illumination. So what am I trying to do here today by bringing forward an oft-forgotten Japanese text? Being a stuffy literature professor? Maybe, but I hope not. I think Basho reminds us of the preciousness of every moment of life and of how to see simple encounters with people and the natural world as possibilities for richer living. His road does not just lead north, but deep into the north. His meetings with people and the rest of nature, along with his visits to sacred places, are awakenings to the preciousness of every day. Many of us here today are here because we're also on a spiritual journey. And we do not have to travel to a far north or any faraway place to see like Basho. I was reminded of this recently when reading Gretel Ehrlich, a Wyoming writer, a wonderful one, who writes of a hike to the source of the Yellowstone River. One witnesses Ehrlich moving from a trudge through the natural world to a philosophical understanding of her own wayfaring. Walking, she says, is almost an ambulation of mind. Wildness, she goes on to say, has no conditions, no sure routes, no peaks or goals. How foolish our preparations for wilderness trips seem now. We pore over maps, we chart our expeditions, we gear up, and she's got that one in quotes, at the trailheads with horse packs, backpacks, fly rods, cameras, forgetting the meaning of simply going. I look up from these thoughts, she says. A blue heron rises from a gravel bar and glides behind a gray screen of dead trees, appears in an opening where an avalanche is down pines, and lands again on the water. Rather like an American haiku, a witnessing, a heron, not at all the thing for which her gearing up had prepared her. Opportunities for chance encounters with the natural and human worlds like those of Ehrlich and Basho, or of the poet of wild geese, Mary Oliver, encounters that might even lead to deeper understanding of self and other, do abound. They are nearby on our own daily pathways as we move through our lives, if we have eyes to see and hearts really open to otherness. An expert in this kind of open wayfaring was, of course, Oliver herself, whom we lost just a few weeks ago, and whose work some of us really enjoyed together late this past fall. On hearing of her death, a writer for the Boston Globe mused, "To read Mary Oliver is to slow down and take notice." Oliver did not need to travel far like Basho in order to wayfare deeply. She simply wandered within the purview of her own home, particularly the home she and her female partner, a photographer, made in Provincetown on Cape Cod. Allow me another written surprise about egrets as I read Oliver's poem about the birds she encountered on a walk to one of the many ponds on the Cape. Now I have to find that one, if you'll wait a second. This is another big favorite of mine, I have to admit. Egrets. Where the path closed down and over, through the scumbled leaves, fallen branches, through the knotted catbrier, I kept going. Finally, I could not save my arms from the thorns. Soon the mosquitoes smelled me, hot, wounded, and came wheeling and whirling. And that's how I came to the edge of that pond, black and empty, except for a spindle of bleached reeds at the far shore, which, as I looked, wrinkled suddenly into 3 egrets. A shower of white fire. Even half asleep, they had such faith in the world that made them, tilting through the water, unruffled, sure, by the laws of their faith, not logic. They opened their wings softly and stepped over every dark thing. For me, Oliver has been, for a very long time, the contemporary apostle of our 7th principle, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. So I'd like to include this Wayfairing deeply with one of her most famous poems, somehow omitted from the selections at the rear of our gray hymnal, which are wonderful, I've always thought. One that shows us how to slow down and take notice, as the Boston Globe writer mentioned about her. And this is called A Summer Day. Who made the world? Who made the swan, the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper, I mean, the one who's flung herself out of the grass, the one who is eating sugar out of my hand, who is moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down, who is gazing around with her enormous, complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to idle and be blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I've been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I've been doing all day. I'm repeating the poem, of course. What could this be other than wayfaring deeply, as I've tried to uncover it today? What amazing things one may discover about life, one's own and others, just by paying close attention and contemplating or even musing about what one sees and hears. Thank you. I think we're ready to extinguish this chalice, are we not? I better take my book. Hang on. Thanks for doing this.